thank you very much for joining our Return Ready conference. I'm joined here today with Ed, Andrew, and Tashi. I'll let you guys go around and introduce yourselves. We do have 1 hour on the clock today, and we've got a little Q&A button down at the bottom, so please be sure to ask your questions as you go along. I'll be moderating the panel, stepping in with some questions and getting some polls going as well. If I can turn over to you, Ed, to introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. Thanks for having us along this morning. Yeah, my name's Ed Phillips, and I run the Intelligent Workplace practice for NTT Limited. And so I'm responsible for our go-to-market around collaboration, mobility, etc., and also how we use technology ourselves within our workplace. And NTT is it's across about 60 countries. We've got about 40,000 people across the globe focused on IT solutions and services.
Thank you.
Great. I'm Andrew Conquest. I work with EY. I'm part of our real estate technology and innovation team, and I work in conjunction with a team across the globe. I look after the APAC area and work a lot with Christina in that area and the team. And we're very much involved in presently the return to office, but also the future planning of what are our offices going to look like and what's our real estate footprint going to look like. So we'll be filling you in on some of those updates today. Thank you.
And my name is Tashi Dorji. So I'm head of flexible space for ANZ over at JLL. And what we're really doing right now is partnering with property owners and landlords to help them create their own flexible spaces, whether it be, desk and commercially orientated or amenity driven, which is particularly interesting, as everyone knows, in the current climate that we're in with everything that's going on with the pandemic, because a lot of the designs we're looking into in the product offerings, which are focused around tenant retention and attraction, has been quite interesting to see evolve working both in the Australian and also the Asian markets.
So that's an interesting point you make around the evolution. And so Ed, you and I were talking recently about the death of the CBD. What do you think about the future of the CBD today, 6 months, 18 months?
Yeah, look, that's probably been a question seemed to come up a lot. With clients assessing how much space they need, whether they still need some of particularly their CBD sort of expensive real estate. So it does seem to come up a lot. I think, however, look, most of the clients that I speak to, at least, I think it's fair to say companies are reviewing what they use their space for, and certainly there's dialogue on how to reorganize space, and that's accelerating obviously because of the last 6 months, and how potentially that space becomes more sort of an agile, sort of flexible space. But I suppose what I see is most business leaders still realize that they need a hub, and I certainly feel that. I think it's a big cultural part of any organization. There's a hub, there's a place to gravitate to, and maybe that's why CBDs obviously have sort of built up in the first place. So I think it's a really important part of corporate identity to have a hub. How that space is used is probably more the discussion moving forward, and obviously from our perspective, how does technology help enable those those future workspaces? But that's I suppose the discussion we're having.
That hub bit's a pretty important one. In terms of the stage of going back into the office, where are you sitting at within the NTT group today?
Yeah, so look, so in some cases we're sort of fortunate that we've sort of moved to agile working, and by the nature of the business that we're in, we're a services company, we're used to having workforces that our workforce is dispersed, it's in and out of out on site with clients, etc. But look, I think the focus right now from our organization and clients we speak to is probably first and foremost around safety at the moment, I would say, and how to coordinate getting back into the office and return to office, which is typically between 30 and 60% capacity, how to actually do that first of all. Now, of course, that's quite challenging for every company, and particularly because the goalposts are moving and different within each region, let alone with each country. So definitely safety orientated right now. There is then that secondary sort of thinking of, okay, is there a cost out opportunity at the same time? And from our perspective, it's technology orientated, but of course, in the workplace area, space is a big question then. But at the same time, I think most organizations are still acutely conscious of the talent war that every industry is in, and the fact that you're still going to need progressive working facilities. You're still going to need to treat employee experience with as a priority. So how can we almost kill three birds with one stone? How do we get the safety pieces orientated? How do we potentially use as a cost out initiative, but also end up with actually a better working environment that's modernized at the same time? So
no, that's a good point. And I mean, when you look at the employee side and what you're talking about, entity being an agile workforce, there's actually quite a few similarities with EY. I recall some of the EY offices in London, you had a 10 employee to 1 desk ratio, which in terms of industry norms is pretty enormous for a pre-COVID world. But in a post-COVID world, I have a feeling that some of those ratios are going to shift a lot. How do you feel about those changing ratios in the human element, Andrew?
So the interesting thing today is that in some ways that fully agile environment that you're talking about, Christina, has changed slightly, in that lots of even the IoT technology and things that we've just introduced to the UK is a little on hold because we've had to go back because of safe distancing, etc. We've had to go back and spread out where people can sit and make certain desks available on a system, and you're almost going back to booking a desk for a while, which is kind of a step backwards in the old world, but it's the reality of where we are today. And in actual fact, if I talk about Australia, we've done a couple of surveys of our people to try and capture how are they feeling. And we did one early on in the pandemic and then a bit later in recent times. The results came out pretty similar in that, we've ascertained that about 20% of our people don't really mind if they don't come back to work to the office ever. They've settled into homework. They like the convenience of working from home. I mean, obviously a lot of people are well set up at home, so that looks great. 11% of our people are keen or were keen to get back ASAP because they might be in a shared house. Some of our junior staff, you imagine you're sharing a house with 4 people. You've got a guy on this Xbox screaming about the show while you're trying to do a conference call, or you might not have great internet connectivity, etc., or really just physically not a great space to work from. So those people are keen. The rest are kind of interested in coming back in a hybrid situation. So some work from home, some coming into the office. And they are not fussed about when they come back. They want it to be the right time. So I think Ed was talking about safety is the big priority. How do we want to, ensure the safety of our people? That's our number one priority. And I think even in the next 6 months, COVID is going to challenge us. I mean, we are seeing offices come back into play. Apart from Melbourne in Australia, the offices are returning. Sydney's occupancy is growing. I think we're at kind of 180 people of 3,000 coming into the office. So it's still very low. And it is restricted because we're only allowing, we've gone back to that booking system of increments of 15 minutes to allow for people to get up in lifts and all that sort of situation. And we're determining what floors they go to, etc. We're starting to relax that a little bit. So I think even the next 6 months will be a hybrid. It really depends on how the location is doing COVID-wise. We're seeing in New Zealand, almost a full return to work. So in parts of China and Korea, same thing. In terms of the next longer term, we're certainly driving a revised workplace strategy that looks at the real estate footprint. We're looking to, develop what we're calling like an expanded network of places, which is your combination of your home, work, maybe some co-working, maybe a bit of hub and spoke model of some other external locations where you're looking to enable this kind of environment of connection and belonging, integrated with those options of alternative areas to work from. So I think that's where we're looking towards.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, and I think most of us are, let's say, done with the commute. You know, the level of benefit that we need to get from the office, the bar has been risen significantly. You know, if I'm going to go and do an hour and a half of commuting like I used to back when I was in Paris, there needs to be a lot more bringing me into the office to make it worthwhile, that 3 hours there and back every day. So the hub
we're seeing that in Japan as well, very much so in Japan, where there's those long travel, periods. Back to you, sorry.
No. So go ahead, Tashi.
I was just going to say, it's weird, but I've been because I've actually had to do a ton of stakeholder interviews, both with existing tenants within assets that we're designing and building flex spaces for and whatnot. The commute debate, it was interesting. There's a lot of actual individuals, both as high as partners within law firms or paralegals. So Andrew, what you were saying earlier is actually a very good point. If you've got a nice place or an office set up at home, it's fine. So management plus, or some of the more senior staff are the ones that are kind of screaming potentially from the rooftop saying, it's great to work from home. I've got my pad. I've got more time to spend time with the kids, or do laundry, or all that kind of stuff. But a large chunk of the workforce that we've spoken to, even when trying to design these spaces, they're in shared houses. They have to do calls from their dimly lit, zero naturally lit, from windows or whatnot bedrooms. So it's awful for them. But from the commute perspective, there are actually a few going, hey, I kind of miss the commute to a certain degree, because that was their me time where they would listen to a podcast. Whereas one could say, hey, but you're at home, so you can figure that out. But it's different, because when you're at home, same as for me, like this morning I was up at 5:30 a.m. on global calls and emails. It's a lot harder to segment that you time, because you're on it as soon as you wake up. So we've actually been hearing a lot of, when you work from home, the argument of productivity could be made that, staff are more productive or they're getting more work done, but it's not sustainable, because overall they're working longer hours. And then, we can get into it later. There's that foundation of all being together in the office for the last 10 years, or even 1 year with your team, has built that communicative foundation and understanding on how to liaise with your colleagues, versus a future without that, that home base to kind of provide that level of understanding and connectivity. And just to strengthen both your points, Ed and Andrew, before JLL, a while ago, I started my own flex company, which was about a network of spaces, so similar to Hub and Spoke, but more on scale, where we would actually turn restaurants and hotels in suburban areas, not just CBD, into a network of co-working spaces, because we put in the technology so people could check into the Wi-Fi and log into a community platform. They get discounts there. They could create a community because they connect with other people. The hospitality staff would be trained to take care of them. And we had over about 10,000 subscribers at that point across APAC. And they all had work from home arrangements or worked from desks, but they wanted to go to a communal area to meet people, to feel activation. It was almost like they treated it as a lifestyle choice rather than, and also just to create new ideas and spur creativity versus working from home all the time. And the other day I even spoke with the head of workplace over at MYOB, and he was even saying, because he really believes in human connection, some of his colleagues were, having a tough time working from home because they're alone. And he even said, why don't you go for a walk today, go to the park and make eye contact with 6 people in a not creepy way, but just make eye contact with 6 people and come back home and see how you feel. And they felt better. So I don't know, call me crazy, but there's a bit of an art and science behind it.
I think there's definitely change management and support and protocols to build. And we're doing that within my group of supporting each other because some people are doing exactly what you said, Tashi, doing too much work, overworking, work-life balance is fused. You've got to have very strong personal boundaries to make sure that you create that time and look at your timetable and work it in, but not everybody has those skills. So I think the really important thing is to have it agile and flexible, so that if it suits me, great. If you prefer to be in there, you should still be allowed to go in, so everyone's probably going to finish up with a lot more choice. And if the technology improves, the ability to work both ideas and make it flexing with them would I think be a great outcome.
And to tie into that, Andrew, one of the big things is, so someone might say, all right, these few days I'm going to work nearby my house. I want to get out of the house, but I'm not necessarily collaborating with a big team. I just want a space where I can work and I can concentrate nearby. And these few days I want to come downtown. The commute's worth it. I'm going to see all my colleagues. I'm going to be mentoring the new guys, learning from the more experienced people, so on and so forth. From a real estate strategy point of view, I mean, Tasha, you're seeing a lot of this on the multi-tenant, on the owner building property side. How are you seeing the real estate strategy shift for these massive organizations?
Yeah, from a property owner and a landlord perspective, there's definitely, even more so recently, been a shift in thinking. Property owners are becoming much more savvy with this whole concept of flexible space, not just because of the benefits for them as an owner of a commercial real estate asset, but it's also what the market's demanding for. So even from a JLL perspective, leveraging that network and be able to work with the leasing guys and the construction guys and whatnot, there's a lot of larger companies now requiring flexible workspace in the future, whether they're not ready to commit to a long-term lease around now because no one really knows what's going to happen, or if they're going to renew in 2 years' time with the asset, a condition of the renewal is that they want at least 1 or 2 floors of flex there. It's a real consideration to be made, not just out of the forward thinkers who we would have been working with maybe a year ago. It's almost like COVID has put it front of mind, definitely. Even if you speak to some of the other flex operators out there who are exploring the management style agreement model, which is essentially, the easiest way to explain it is Hilton Hotels used to own all their hotels 10 years ago, 5 years ago even. Since then, they've moved into an asset-light business model where they actually don't own the hotel. So if you see a Hilton down the road, they don't own that building. It's owned by a hotel owner, and they essentially manage it, put their brand on, get paid a fee to put their staff in and run it and operate it for them. So a similar approach for flexible space operators in the market to do that for these landlords. Even the operators are starting to, even over the last 8 weeks, I'd say as recent as that, get a lot more inquiries from commercial real estate landlords going, hey, we need to put in a floor or 2 of flex into our asset because it's what our tenants are asking for, or even out of a need from competition. Hey, the building across the road, which is also an A-grade premium asset, is putting 2 floors of flex in. We really need to do that now as well, because we don't want our tenants within our asset going across the road to use their flex because they may need some overflow space, whether it be we need to hire more people, we need more flexible space. We don't want to sign a lease for these 30 more people, but we'll take 30 desks within a project space or a flexible suite across the road, that kind of stuff. But aside from spillage, I think one of the key and actually really encouraging and beautiful things that's happening within the industry, and we'll see a lot of this in the new year too, is, I don't really like the term of the word, but it's the easiest way to call it, the hotelification of buildings and commercial real estate. So essentially what that means is that landlords have realized that to promote loyalty, to create a really good experience when you enter their office lobby or their floor of flexible space, they don't want to make it feel like an office. They want it to make it feel very hospitality centric and hospitality driven, almost creating a destination. And even more so now, if people are like, well, why do we need the office, or should I go back? They almost want to create a lifestyle driven product. So you want to go there. So it's like, even if it's a few days a week, I want to go there because I want to eat at my local. I want to have a coffee at the cafe. I want to meet my team members. I want to use the wellness space. I want to be around people. There's a lot of thinking around that, to the point where the original conversations, let's say, 9 to 10 months ago, building these types of flex spaces potentially for landlords to put in their buildings to offer to their tenants would have been primarily desk focused, not super dense like co-working, rewind 2-3 years, where you have your really dense floor plates where they just try and pack it so that they can charge for the desks to make it a commercial model, but then do a lot of, promote community and activation and whatnot. It's much more less desk dense now because of professional distancing, but it's less, how do we make this floor commercial? It's now, okay, as long as we cover costs and we cover what our market expected rent for that floor would be, we would really like for you to design something, Tash, where you don't take the traditional 60 to 70% of the NLA of this floor plate to turn into desks and suites and meeting spaces, which you could charge for. We want you to take some more of that space to create a multi-purpose event space, to create a clubhouse area, to create a really cool arrival lounge that may be integrated into the clubhouse so you can get smart around, depending on the floor plate, to make the most of the space, all that kind of stuff. Because things that aren't really communicated on a P&L, like the soft drivers today, like tenant retention or attraction or differentiating your assets so people want to go there, is becoming way more important, which I think is really cool.
It absolutely is. But we're not going to go and build an entire hotel-like GDS system for all the reservations of each and every space and doing the elastic pricing. But having a completely integrated technical footprint, digital footprint, becomes a lot more interesting, because you need to have that differentiated experience before anybody ever steps in the door. And I think that people coming to these flex spaces, they're not going to have the patience to interface with 25 different pieces of software like they might have been willing to do in the past with, when they were their own occupier themselves. So, that kind of comes into your domain, Ed, which is where you're bringing together these workplace experience platforms and solutions and starting to build that full integration layer for your customers. What are you seeing for the future of tech for the workplace to enable this shift?
Yeah, look, just make some comments as I sort of lead up to that. So listen to Tashi then. It's super interesting, and it's funny actually. It sort of reminds me, this whole sort of hotelification that you mentioned. It sort of reminds me a bit of cloud and the sort of move to on-demand consumption-based space like we've got to with technology. Of course, just like cloud, for clients that know they're going to have a certain capacity and certain requirement, if they pre-commit, there's obviously going to be a commercial benefit potentially, but I think potentially now there's much more flex as we look forward, and sort of seen two sort of things happen in organizations in a lot of cases, getting out of the flex space they've had, but then reinvesting in the remaining space. Is actually probably what we've seen more right now. But to answer your question directly, so if you want to get more space efficiency ultimately, and that might be with a single tenant or obviously with multiple tenants, buildings need to get smarter, right? And I think the concepts are actually quite easy to understand. So when we're explaining to organizations how to, just for a single tenant, how to build a proper agile workspace, which typically will, have a less square meterage per person than a traditional workspace. And look, in our own case, we went, I believe, from say about 14 or 15 square meters per head in our Sydney office, as an example, down to 9, and actually ended up with a hell of a lot more collaboration work points and just a much better workspace. But at the same time, we actually made there was a financial benefit there as well. In order to make that work, there are a few really key pieces of technology that are required. The first is just having an understanding of how locations are actively being used. So to be able to find a source of location services, which can be the network, it can be sensors, to actually glean that information, so then you can start to make decisions. So if spaces aren't used, you can free them up. It's a really simple example. And so what we've started to do is develop a a smart spaces platform, if you like. It's really a capability that connects lots of systems together. So it connects to understand how people are using technology, so what they're doing, how they're collaborating, etc. But also then connected with information which tells you where they are. And when we actually bring those two pieces of information together, we can start to get quite sophisticated. First of all, in freeing up space where people are not using that space, and also though trying to understand how people are collaborating and where people are clustering physically. In some cases, it's got more psychological or psychology centric, if you like, where one company we're working with is looking at, well, how are my actual communications flowing between people, so they can actually remove single points of failure around not being able to disseminate information effectively. Obviously, there's a whole agility benefit. So in our current offices, as an example, we know through the analytics that we've gleaned, we could actually get much more aggressive around space. So we could actually get, I think we've got about another 30% headroom to grow within our current space now from that analytics. And the last thing is probably more around one to do with wellness, which is, and obviously there are privacy concerns around tracking people and understanding how they're operating, what they're doing. So it's important to communicate that we're doing that for the right reasons. But when you do that, of course, there's a bunch of other information that can be additive to culture and additive to wellness. So we've done quite a few wellness trials around, obviously, smart watches, as you imagine. We've also got some innovation with NTT around technology that monitors people's ECGs. We've used that for executive wellness programs. So there's a bunch of innovation there that, to be honest, may well become compliant over time, because I think we're going to see more and more compliance regulations around, if people are in the office, and WH&S now obviously extends right into pandemic type situations, and there are some pretty pretty considerable penalties for organizations who don't follow that. I suspect we'll see more wellness type guidelines and regulations coming, and technology is going to be important to that as well. Look, maybe last thing is when it gets into multi-tenanted environments, that's when it actually becomes more complicated, because as Tash will tell you, for new builds, it's probably maybe more straightforward, but we do still struggle in scenarios where, in multi-tenant environments, where technology isn't at maybe the forefront of planning around that ecosystem, and retrofitting that across multiple tenants within one building can actually be quite challenging. It can be challenging for visitor management. It can be challenging for BMS integration, which everyone wants for various reasons, and obviously cultural and change considerations as well. So that's still something I think maybe needs to be cracked, but it's definitely people more literate with technology now and how they need to plan for it.
It'll be, Ed, just to add on that, you'll be happy to know that I've been pushing, even for the projects in APAC, to involve tech on day one, even from an infrastructure perspective, because you need to understand how to do the fit out. So you would have to work with the designers and the builders to make sure that all works for you. But the point about you measuring usage and foot traffic and who uses what is, I think, really valuable. And I think, Andrew, you've got some thoughts on that as well, where technology is going and the stuff you've been working on. But
yeah,
as a really quick throwaway story, despite all the news around WeWork, I remember speaking with some of the execs there about a year ago, and they used analytics and data for one of their buildings over in the States, which was more of a co-living asset. And they found that despite having flex floors and all this kind of stuff and amenity-driven floors throughout the building, one place that majority of the users would cluster would be in one of the lower ground floors where the laundry area was to do laundry. And it would always be on Thursdays, Fridays, and Sundays. And there was quite a lot of space there, just dead space. So after reviewing those analytics, they actually leveraged data to turn that area into one of the community-driven, amenity-driven areas. So they put some ping pong tables, all that kind of stuff. And it turned out to be a really great way to connect people from a human to human perspective. So that's just a small example that I thought was a success for them, how they kind of took those numbers and then rejigged some of their zoning. That really worked.
Yeah, like I think the same concept now applies to, you know, we're using essentially the same technology now, but for a different purpose, being social distancing and desk booking and shift working. But yeah, Andrew, I think keen to sort of build hear from you based on the conversation we've had recently on this.
Yeah, we're doing exactly what you're talking about, Ed. And the great thing is that in some ways, you know, the COVID, the pandemic has brought it much more into fruition. So anything that we're talking about in the future, it's almost like a given, and hopefully becomes a given that we would incorporate that IoT platform. We call it a workplace experience platform as well, which integrates your IoT sensors, beacons to achieve all the things that you talked about. And also to create a workplace app, as Christina was talking about, that pulls it all together, incorporates with the building, incorporates with the services of the building, catering, ordering your coffee on the way in. We want to extend that also to capture the new, potentially reduced footprint and perhaps less availability of people to come into the space, to also move that towards AI and suggesting when to come in and when perhaps not to come in, but in a kind of a nice way instead of a dictating way, if you know what I mean. So you're making it look like you are looking like you're incorporating with the way that that person wants to work. So, you know, suggesting that if Christina and I are in, Christina's already in the office, they can see tomorrow and we have 3 meetings. Well, Andrew, why don't you come into the office? So extending that to incorporate all the things that you did, but also to support this kind of new way of working. So I think that's definitely it's part of our longer term structure for, say, Oceania practice, that those sort of tools just become absolutely have tos, because they're the way that we're going to be able to move forward with that new space. And that thought of the office as being a destination still supports this connection and belonging. But, you know, we were talking about some of the planning that we've done in the last 12 months even was to create for Melbourne an office space that did have that more, like Tash was talking about, the more centralized sharing of spaces, you know, whether it be function areas, whether it be cafes, business lounges, so that people can collaborate across the space. So we're definitely looking towards that. It's about, I suppose, for us and our internal stakeholders, getting them to take that leap of faith. And one of the challenges at the moment is, you know, people are concerned about the future. What's a business look like? Whilst we're talking about all this, then when it comes to the reality, is they're a little bit afraid to spend the money right now to a certain point, because what is it going to look like and how long will we be out of Melbourne office, et cetera, et cetera. So we're seeing some conversions and some thought process towards it, but not necessarily ready to jump to it quite yet. But we're looking at some longer term planning that matches our leasing renewal programs, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, that's where we're coming from.
Tying up the ROIs on some of these projects, Andrew?
Yeah, exactly. And that's where I think that the data that we can collect from that occupancy, as we were talking about, especially if we're going to create more collaboration spaces, which seems to be the way to go, being able to capture the activity in those spaces with sensors is an integral part, because as we go to do the next building, will it make sense? So even in our existing Melbourne office, we're doing a revamp of the client space. I've costed up and suggested we put the sensors into that space so that we truly understand how are we using those meeting rooms. You know, you've always got that question. There's 312 people meeting room, 10 8 people, 4. Are they actually being used? So we're going to sensor or propose to sensor every chair so that we understand what is the usage? So in 6 years' time, when we go to build a new space, we'll understand how we're using it and how that may change again in a post-COVID world. You know, we'll have some good data.
That's a great point. And talking about the client services experience, you know, for us, obviously, we're in visitor management, so it's so much more important to manage how external people come into the office. So for us, it's really explaining the rules before they ever get there so that they know exactly what's happening, that we run the health checks before they ever get in contact with your front desk team, your front of house team, from a health and safety perspective, just to make sure everybody's covered off. And so that flow and automating that flow becomes important, both from a compliance and an efficiency point of view, because we can't just keep adding more tasks for the front of house team.
Also, with that, I wanted to say there also the flexibility that your system offers, so that if you're in Singapore and there's an outbreak and literally overnight the government changes the guidelines, you can let people know. So you know, one person can manage that instead of, you know, I think that's a really important current COVID opportunity.
Oh, absolutely. And you'd be surprised at some of the help desk calls and phone calls that I'm getting. You know, Saturday night, I was on the way to, Saturday afternoon, I was on the way to the beach, and I had a customer call me on my personal phone, just said, Christina, I can't remember how to run reports. Someone's in the office with COVID. We got to do contact tracing. The government's on their way. Can you remind me how to run a report? And so, well, just press the little down button and you'll have it all. So it's, you know, the level of mission critical has really changed. But one thing that I'd be interested on getting your perspective, the three of you, is from a multi-tenant world. It used to be that all employees were considered welcome. It's no longer the case. Everybody's not welcome anymore. And so we are seeing an increased number of buildings and individual tenants authorizing or deauthorizing access control credentials based upon if somebody has successfully booked and been approved to come into the building that day. Is that something that you're seeing locally in Australia?
We did incorporate self-certification in with our tool, so that you made your booking and then you would get notification within a few hours of your entry if that hadn't been completed. And then we were actually cancelling the booking. They've kind of relaxed that a little bit, but in the early days that's happening, and that's earmarked to be completely driven across the US as they return to office, because they're a bit slower to return. So yes, I think that it's all part of what my organization is working towards, is that better access control, and the access control driven, you know, maybe through your mobile device, etc. All that it would make it easier to control that. You know, if you seriously stop someone's access and they can't come in, you know, it's more effective than just cancelling their booking because they could still turn up.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we'll see things like that happen.
Very good.
Sorry, I just muted myself there by accident. That's probably the phrase of the 2020 is I'm on mute. But
Seen a few t-shirts. Seen a few people wearing those t-shirts.
Like, it's interesting to talk about this stuff anyway, because I think, you know, we are sort of in, you know, a big cultural change right now, one of the biggest probably you can think of in recent times, and still sort of learning. So look, but when answering that question around access, I don't believe we're at the point yet where we would actively deny access to someone because they're not booked, even though potentially we would, because of course, you know, we actually can't, you know, definitely don't want to be in a situation where we put our, you know, the regulatory stuff at risk. But and like, this is probably a bit of a technology plug, but I assume that's why I'm on the call, is more from a technology perspective. I suppose what I would say to that is, doing any of these COVID compliant activities is actually, as soon as you're in a building of any significant numbers of people, is actually extremely, it's so labor intensive that it's actually not achievable without the use of tech, and also effective use of technology. So that scenario you just mentioned is all dependent on an organization having a a strategy which is all identity based. So as if you're a user, you have access to certain services depending on who you are and where you are. And that all actually is architecturally built into, needs to be built into organizational thinking before they get, implement these systems. And as a result of that, it's actually fairly easy to grant or deny access based on who you are and where you are and when you're there, if you get that architecture in place. So certainly achievable. I think the other thing that's definitely an issue right now is without location services and understanding of where people are, anybody, including me, could go and sit at the wrong desk. And if you get to the point where you've got, a 4-floor building with 700 people in it or 600 people in it, and you're not actually, you can't report on where people have actually been, cleaning that whole space on a daily basis, is probably not feasible. So you sort of need that intelligence to be built in when you've got an organization of any size. And yeah, visitor management is the other thing. We've actually using your system globally now because we need to be compliant across 543 buildings. We need to report on that. And who's visited and when, and be compliant in that regard. So technology is becoming super important right now around COVID compliance, right?
Absolutely.
I just really quickly add to that from a design and build perspective for Flex, future-proofing the floor within the asset, whether you're delivering 1 or 2 floors or also an amenity-driven ground floor lounge offering too, is something always to be considered and something that landlords like to hear. And by that, I mean, aside from technology, which is really important, even just approaching the floor plate in a way which is a lot less dense in desks as it may have been initially proposed a year earlier, because then it accommodates for less of a populace on the floor, even though metrics will demonstrate, most spaces are only ever occupied 60 to 70% of the time anyway. So that kind of stuff is really important, and it doesn't necessarily have to be set in stone. So you have to design those things in a smart enough way where you can accommodate for a higher density if things improve. But additionally, the analytics add to what you're saying and saying is important, even from a day 1 versus day 2 of what the flexible space you put in could look like today or in 8 months' time. Because even if you look at it from a business perspective, a lot of these landlords are putting these flex spaces in there to also generate a commercial return so that it can pay back for the fit out costs they put in, or that it at least covers the equivalent of what they would have got if they rented the space out, especially if it's a low or a mid-rise floor rather than just a on the ground floor, which they can kind of put within outgoings or attribute it more to an amenity, which raises the whole question about building valuation and whatnot, but that's another can of worms. It is important because as you scale up occupancy of that floor as a business, because you're trying to fill it, the office suites and the meeting spaces, by looking closely at the technology, say you accommodate for, as a business, within 12 to 18 months, that's when you're going to fill the flex space, whether it be internally driven with the tenants in the building or attracting tenants within the portfolio or marketing it to third parties and externals. So when you're looking at the usage, some of the suites or project spaces or desk space may be designed in a way that could be also meeting space or vice versa, because the technology will show when you're trying to limit or, hit certain targets or limit who comes in. If you realize you're selling the meeting spaces or they're being used a lot more than the suites, then you may want to turn one of the suites that you were originally using, which may not have been used as much, into a meeting space to accommodate for that traffic. And similarly, if the meeting spaces weren't being used as much, the service meeting spaces, but you're starting to see that the suites are being used a lot, if you have a few multi-purpose meeting spaces that aren't really integrated heavily with AV or technology, because we are seeing a lot of these small meeting rooms being asked for by landlord-driven flex spaces, because a lot of their tenants are like, we're going to do a lot of tech agnostic calls. So, on our floor, it might be WebEx or whatnot, but we need to use Zoom and Teams, and we need a small room to do a professional call. Like, rather than me just be on my laptop in here kind of thing, it'd be set up really professionally. So you could do a really important call with someone, if it was, because it would be set up real nice, you could flip those into suites and that kind of stuff. So the metrics are really important, even from not just a nice to have, but even a commercial perspective for these new up and coming flex spaces for landlords.
Yeah,
Love
that
it.
makes sense.
Thank you, guys. This is extraordinarily interesting for me. I'm just going to ask if any of the attendees have any questions that they'd like to pop in the chat. And while we're doing that, do any of the three of you have any closing remarks?
I think from us, it's, and we've mentioned the terms agile, it's about experience, it's about creating the office as a place to be connected and belonging. It's a destination, but it may not be a destination for every day. So how we're starting to use the term our workforce. How do our workforce want to work moving forward? And you've also got the, the difference between millennials and baby boomers, so how does the whole thing integrate? And then you've got the elephant in the room of the pandemic to get past and get used to, because listening to the news today, no likely vaccine till 2022. So we're going to be dealing with this next year as well. So that's kind of where our head is, and that experience platform is the big piece.
Yeah, like for me, like it'd be foolish to sort of pretend that we know what's going to happen next. But like when I present at conferences and talk to clients around workplace and experience, I'd always be asking, hey, what's your vision for your employee experience, right? What, I assume it's one of, diversity, it's one of flexibility, all of those things. Now, of course, a lot of that is still valid, but that has probably changed a bit somewhat in the last 6 months. But I think it is important to get back to still have very much a clear vision for what you want your employee experience to be, and the workplace itself is obviously going to potentially look different, and some of the thinking will probably change over the next 6 months, but you can definitely feel that it's going to be a cultural hub for the organization. Regardless, it'll look different. It'll definitely be a collaboration hub, and for team working, and still be a social hub as well. So definitely it's still going to have that, but we're going to need to be pretty agile over the coming months and years. So look, there's definitely a safety and a cost out focus now. When it gets back to that workplace vision, I think from a technology perspective, at least, you can start planning for that now, and there are some decisions that can be made that will mean that you can be agile as and when the time comes. So yeah, it's going to be interesting, and I think we're going to actually need to keep communicating as an industry, and because things are going to change.
And to that point too, Ed, we were reasonably agile already and well connected in technology, so we could switch very quickly into that home related, and the business has not suffered for that. So building on that means that you are more adaptable to what we don't know. If there's going to be another pandemic in 5 years, I mean, you just don't know. So I think to the point of all the work that we've done so far in the building of that technology and functionality, it's paid off even today.
Yeah, same. Yeah.
I've talked enough about some of the more serious stuff, but so for on a personal level, I just can't see myself doing my job from home. Like I have the flexibility to work from home, but I've been coming to the office every day. I'm in Sydney, by the way, for the last 4 or 5 months. And it's mainly because, and it's different for everyone's jobs, but to be able to just grab the leasing guys over there, the builders upstairs, or the property asset management guys, around the corner, is crucial for me to hit deadlines and get stuff done, because it's like a 30-second conversation, you know, versus it's not something I'd set time for a meeting for, or would want to send an email for, because I'm not really sure what I'm asking for half the time. It's more, we need to figure it out on the spot. And then also personally, part of the reason why I come to the office is wellness driven. So if there's any golfers on the call who eventually watches this when it's emailed out, boxing's really great because it's not like necessarily always like the Rocky or the Creed movies where you need to be like packed with muscle to punch really hard. It's just like golf, where if you get the momentum and you shift your weight correctly, you feel really powerful. And so I love golf, and that's why, like, you know, it took me a long time to get my swing, so I wasn't just trying to hit the crap out of the ball to get distance. So yeah, I've got boxing in 30 minutes, and I think that's really important to me, to go to the office as a destination, to do some classes and that kind of stuff, and then use the end of trips to shower or the gym or whatever, as long as they're practicing professional distancing and all social distancing and all that kind of stuff, and cleanliness. And I really think wellness is an important one, and we touched on it earlier, Ed, but you know, the next question is, what does wellness mean for you? Because all the landlords and the property owners are saying wellness, 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 but then you got to really figure out what that means to them. And what it really means to them is what it means for their tenants ultimately, or the tenants they're aspiring to have. So it's different for everyone. Yep.
So I think if we kind of sum this up, it's about employee choice and workforce choice. It's about managing people and their identities, not necessarily just desks and meeting rooms, right? We're going to be reconfiguring everything based on how people use the space, but we need to really work and use tech and use our designs to work on how people are coming in. And that kind of coming in 5 days a week in the same way, you know, that hub and spoke model is going to change things. We're going to change how we design our buildings. We're going to change how we fit them out, how we measure them, and our approach at flexibly changing that workplace setup over time. You know, from my perspective, you know, I can tell you, I am very happy to be back in the office again. But for me, what it is I ended up just getting a bit burned out, because I'd spend the whole day at my desk at home. So on the weekend, rather than resting, all I wanted to do was get out of the house. So I'd spend these 16-hour days doing sports on the weekend, and then I'd come back into the office, well, my bedroom, in my office on Mondays, absolutely shattered. So for me, I'm quite excited to be back in the office. And, you know, I hope that we are able to get to a point where, even if not everybody's in the office, everybody has the option to work in the place where they're able to get their best work, their best collaboration, their best mentorship done. We'll close the call out now. Thank you very, very much, Ed, Andrew, and Tashi, for your time. I really appreciate it.